Hi there everyone and welcome to another episode of Tip of the Week. So I just finished up doing a frame-by-frame animation series that was, a basic kickstart guide to kind of just how to do frame-by-frame animation. And I had some really great feedback from that, and people were requesting something similar but for cutout animation. So, there is a wealth of wonderful material on the Toon Boom website available for how to do cutout character rigging and animation. But, the videos are a little bit longer because they go into all the detail of all the different things that you can do. So this guide is more of a quick start, let's just get up and get running and understand how cutout works and how to do cutout character rigging and animation in Toon Boom. So when you are thinking about doing cutout, basically what happens with cutout is there are a few main steps to keep in mind. The first is your character breakdown. This is the process by which you analyze a character that you have in a model sheet and you break it down into separate pieces. The second step is the character rigging stage, where you actually create the hierarchy of the character and you connect together all of the different drawing layers so that you can animate them. After you've rigged the elements together in a hierarchy, there's an advanced kind of optional stage of adding effects. So these sorts of effects are the ones that allow you to cut off some drawing layers and mask them, basically. Similar to how was done in some of the other Tip of the Week tutorials, like if you've seen the eye rig and the head rig, those tutorials use that concept in them. A lot of the concepts that I'm going to go over in this little Kickstart series are also in some of the other Tip of the Week, so if you need more detail and you want to go back and watch those other ones, then you can do that as well. So after we rig the characters together, and you've got your hierarchy, you've got the breakdown done, then the last thing really is to test your animation. And it's always a good idea to test doing some animation on a character rig before you get going. Make sure that you understand how to do it. And it's a good step to sort of just check to see if your rig works. And sometimes as you're animating, you may have to go back through and make adjustments to the rig for things that you might figure out, oh, that didn't work so well. So, you can always go back as you go and make some changes and adjustments. So we're going to break those different sections up into different weeks because it's too much to go over all in one week. And I'm going to sort of go over each section in a more basic manner just to kind of really get you up and running. And if you want more advanced details, then I can do advanced sort of sessions on those specific subjects. Or you can go back and check out some of the individual subjects, like, for example, how to deal with the elbow fold, the eye rig, the head rig, swapping out deforms. These are some of the advanced tutorials that were already done in the Tip of the Week channel that you can check out. So this week we're going to start out with character breakdown, how to take your character and break it down into different layers. So for the purpose of this tutorial, I did go ahead and make a model sheet in Photoshop, and I chose to do this only because a lot of people still do this. It's not my recommendation that you should create your model sheet in Photoshop. In fact, I sort of was banging my head against the wall a little bit last night drawing in Photoshop, just because I'm so used to drawing in Toon Boom, and there's so many great drawing tools in Toon Boom that you don't really need to do your model sheet in Photoshop anymore. You can do the design of your character all directly in Toon Boom. And this saves you a couple of steps. First of all, you will just do all your drawings only once because you'll do the drawings directly in Toon Boom. You'll be able to take advantage of having vectors. A couple of things that slowed me down when I was going through this process last night is that there were some times when I wanted to change the colors in my character model here. So, I had done this sort of a necklace thing here, and originally the necklace had been designed with a yellow chain, so it looked like a gold chain, and I didn't like the color, so I had to go back and kind of like just draw on top of the yellow with the brown. There was no easy way to, when you use the magic wand, it selects too much or too little. It's kind of irritating when you have to go in and change colors. So when you do that in Toon Boom, of course, you have the flexibility of being able to adjust your palette. And you can always say, hey, this is really just a rough model sheet, and we'll work out the final colors later in Toon Boom, and that's okay too. But as a workflow, You don't need to go to Photoshop first. The other thing that can be sometimes annoying about working in Photoshop is that you do have this really separated layer concept, and then you're constantly kind of creating new layers to make it easier to do things and then merge them back together again. And in Toon Boom, if you want to have separated line and fill, then you can do that using the sub-art layers and things like that, which I'll go into when we go into Toon Boom. If you've done your model sheet though in Photoshop, or if a designer or somebody has done your model sheet in Photoshop, then you can bring it into Toon Boom. And I wanted to show you this process so that you would see how you do that if you do need to do that. Some people also do bring in Illustrator files. And if you're bringing in Illustrator files, you do have the ability to keep the layers separate. There's a script for it in Harmony, and I think it does it by default now, or there's a preference now in Animate and Animate Pro to do that. These tutorials, by the way, that I'm doing for the cutout is really only good for Animate and Animate Pro. Animate's tools are too basic to do the advanced stuff that I'm going to do on this character. You may also notice that I've chosen to do kind of an anime style, Japanese style character, and I've been doing that with quite a few of my tips recently. So you might be asking, oh gosh, why is she really stuck in that style? And a couple of reasons. I've been doing a lot of work in Japan. I'm actually on my way to Japan tomorrow. So Japan is on my brain, and I'm kind of trying to think a lot about how the tools that we have suit the workflows that they do. And it's also just a style that appeals to me in many different ways. I also love cartoony style. I also love realistic style. The fact of the matter is that with Toon Boom you can do any style that you want. So, you know, if I show you this tip using a Japanese style character, you can do this for a cartoony style character as well. There's nothing to prevent you from doing that. So if I have a Photoshop file and I want to bring this into Toon Boom, the first thing to be aware of is the layers that you've worked with in Photoshop. So in this case, I've got, you know, the front part of the hair, the back part of the hair, you know, the irises on the eyes. I do have some separated layers here. And you can choose whether you want to import these layers separate or not. I do recommend redrawing them in Vector if you have done them in Bitmap first. If you've drawn in Illustrator, there's no need to do any redrawing. But if you've done them in Photoshop, you can rig bitmap elements in Toon Boom, and especially now that we have the deform tool and the deform does work on bitmap, then you can do that if you want to. But there are advantages to using vector lines. So the thing about bitmap is that if I zoom in far enough, eventually I'm going to see pixels, right? And this makes it difficult for doing, you know, a lot of different scenes where there are some scenes that might be close up and some scenes that might be far away. If I'm really far away from my character, I might need my lines to be a little bit thicker, things like that. So I do recommend redrawing, and I'll show you some of the tools that we want to draw with when we do in Toon Boom. But you still may want to keep the lines separate to make it kind of easier for you to go and redraw. I also personally like a method where I kind of put the clothes on my character. In other words, you know, I do have a few different sort of, I've got the hoodie there on top, I've got the sweater there underneath, and sorry, he's got some laces that are hanging out there. And then, you know, he's got the necklace there, and then he's got a body underneath everything. So I don't usually bother to put the body underneath the legs because I never take my character's pants off, but if you're ever planning on having a scene, you know, like maybe this character needs to go to the beach or something and he needs to have a swimsuit on. In that case, I would do my character rig with him naked underneath, and then I would swap out the drawing or create a new layer that has the clothing on top. And the reason is that gives you the flexibility then in your rig of changing the clothes on the character. So, you know, I can swap the drawing out for a different sweater, and then this can be a totally different, you know, day the character's wearing. And it used to be that it was very difficult to have different clothing rigs, and I think that's something that is a lot easier to do nowadays. So that's one of the things I think is really fun about rigging in Toon Boom. So I do like to have my characters kind of naked underneath up to a certain point. I'm going to keep his pants on for this demo. But it's up to you. If you know that your character never has a scene where he has to take his shirt off, then, you know, just always rig him with his shirt on. That's fine too. So the thing is, when I bring this into Toon Boom, I can choose to bring it in with separated layers, or I can choose to bring it in all as one big drawing, as one flattened drawing. if you're going to bring it in as one flattened drawing, you don't need to do anything else. If you do want to bring it in as separate layers, in Photoshop, you do have to put groups around the different layers. The reason that we do it this way is that Photoshop has its own kind of Photoshop animation thing in it, where you can actually animate different layers so that they have a timeline. This is the Photoshop animation. So by default, what Toon does is when we import Photoshop files, different layers come in as different cells on the same layer in the timeline. And then if you want to have a new layer, you just have to put it in a new group. And if you're being really good about it, then you might also want to name the groups as well, because the group, I think, is going to be the name of your layer. So let's call this body and neck, and this group is going to be bracelet, and so on. So let's try to do that again. So you'll notice that because it's taking the original layers of your file, it does not accept a lot of the special characters. So especially if you're working in a different language, like if you're working in Japanese, for example, you want to make sure that you are working with files that have not too many special characters either. So even in the name of the Photoshop file, I might want to go back and name that differently as well. So if I do a save as on this one, then I'll just call this character model sheet merged with an underscore. And there we go. Okay, so now if we check out what it did in my timeline here, is it did bring in all of the different layers that I had done in Photoshop into separate layers here in Toon Boom. If for any reason you want to stick with the bitmap layers and rig with those layers, you can actually get started right away now. But I really do like to redraw my layers in vector so that I could take advantage of using Toon Boom's pencil lines, for example. So when you're looking at a character, the first thing you need to do a successful breakdown is analyze your character, take a look at your character, and figure out which drawings should go on their own layers. The most basic type of breakdown, and I'll just kind of draw it on the side next to the character here. So the other thing is that right now I see that the other layers that I'm working with are kind of washed out, and this is because I have the light table turned on. So if you go to view and then light table, you can uncheck that. It makes it easier to kind of look at both at the same time. I do like to have the light table on when I'm actually doing my drawings. It's just that right now while I'm explaining I'm going to turn it off. So the most basic type of breakdown that you can possibly have is a body, a neck, a head, an arm, a hand, an arm, a hand, and a leg. Nowadays you can even do your leg all as one piece because of the wonderful deform tool. So basically a leg, a foot, a leg, a foot. So that's your most basic. What usually happens is you will break it down a little bit more than that. The head in particular I'm going to treat kind of as its own group because you want to take advantage of a lot of the advanced rigging stuff for the head. The head is the most important thing to rig very well, and the reason is that you're going to use the head a lot when you're talking. There's a lot of shows that we'll even call quote-unquote talking head shows, which are shows that have a lot of dialogue but not a lot of action. So characters aren't really fighting each other in kung fu fighting scenes. There's just a lot of dialogue and a lot of comedy. So those sort of talking head shows, the head rig is the most important thing. And there is a separate tip on how to do the head rig, and I will go over it in a basic way in this one, but we'll treat that separately later. The neck you always want to have separate so you can move the neck around. Anything that you want to move around separately, then you want to have on its own layer. So if I'm going to go in here now, say this is my basic character rig, then if I'm going to go in here, let's say basic, if I'm going to go in here now and kind of analyze my character and take a look at what I want to do on my character, then I'll do that just on the side here. So basically I'm thinking about it before I do it so that I don't have to redo my work later. So if I think about it on this character, I'm going to need to do the neck on its own layer so I can move it around. Remember I said I like to do with my characters with their clothes underneath it so that I have the ability to swap on or swap off the clothes, change the outfits, that sort of thing. Some people also accomplish that by still using just one layer for the trunk of the body, but you know, having a drawing swap for when they have their clothes off, that's fine too. That's another way of doing it. So in this case, basically, we have one layer for the trunk of the body. Okay, so we'll be able to bend and warp this layer of the trunk probably by putting a deform that might be a bone style deform that's going to look something like this with a couple of bones in the middle with a really large bone, and then you'll be able to sort of bend and twist the axis of the bone like so. So this bone rig that we'll do will apply for that body layer. We'll also have a separate layer on top for the sweater that will apply to the same, you know, rig. And if I need to have the jacket on, I may have a separate layer for the jacket as well. So that, because I might want to animate it separately. So if I need to animate the pieces of the jacket, that needs to have its own layer. So the laces here, let's draw this in a different color so it's easier to see. The laces here will need to have their own drawing so that I can animate those. I'll either be able to animate them using a deform, a curved deform, or simply by redrawing if I want to just redraw those. The necklace will need to have its own layer. Okay, so we'll need to do one layer for the jacket here. This is kind of a good way of doing it, maybe just drawing on top. One layer each for each side of the jacket. We'll also need to have a separate layer for the hoodie portion on each side so that we can animate that separately. And when we do things and we break down the drawings, we also want to have this concept of overdrawing. So in other words, I see the jacket here. When I do this piece of the jacket, I'm actually going to draw it the entire width underneath as well, and maybe even all the way under, and then have the neck sit on top. And then I can allow the hoodie portion here to sit on top of it. That way it gives me the flexibility of moving those layers around. And I'll show you what I mean when I do that. So then I have my sweater as its own layer also. The arms you can treat in a couple of different ways. You can treat them as one drawing layer that has a bone system in it. That's usually how I do it these days because it gives you the flexibility if you do have texture to have some bend in the texture around the edge. So we'll try to do it that way as one long drawing with a bone in the middle and see how that goes. If we do the rig and it doesn't work, then you can always break it down more and create different layers out of it. Legs, these days I usually do need to have a separated sort of crotch area so that you have some overlap between the legs and that crotch, and then you have a separate drawing for the leg, and then one drawing connected with a bone series in the leg as well is usually the easiest way to go, especially if you have texture. If you have texture, you need to use the deform system so that you can see the bending of the texture. And then when it comes down to things like the feet, then I usually like to separate these out into the kind of shoe layer behind and then a shoe layer in front. So, you know, if I have a little piece there that has to go in front of the pants, then those will be two separate layers, like so. So that's generally kind of how I'm going to break this character down. When it comes to the head now is going to be way more detailed. I need a separated drawing for the ear. I need a separated drawing for the nose. I need a separated drawing for the mouth. That part is pretty clear. You need a separate drawing for the actual head itself, the face, and you may want to even put a deform around the edge of the face, a curve style deform connected by some dots, so that you can animate the shape of the face. This was also done in the head rig tutorial. What you can find in the eye rig tutorial is the eye needs to be broken down into eyebrow, the sort of color of the eye, the white of the eye, and then the iris. All of those are separate drawing layers. And that gives you the flexibility of animating them separately. And then we also need to deal with the hair. Now this character has some pretty detailed hair. So when it comes to characters that have detailed hair, what I'll usually do is separate those out into different drawing layers. So I'll probably have one layer for this piece here, one layer for this piece here. It doesn't need to be totally separate, but then I can put curved deforms on these different pieces and animate them separately. So one piece there, maybe one piece in the back, one piece over here if I want to animate that side separately, and then one piece down here, and then I'll have a kind of underlying back layer underneath everything so that I have something that is just underneath. So that's basically how I'm going to do this character. I'll also have, of course, drawings for the hands. So hands are always on their own drawing so that you can swap them out. And then I have my bone here. Now, you may go through this sort of analysis process at the beginning and think you have it all figured out. Oh, and then one drawing for the bracelet. You think you may have it all figured out, but if this character has to change clothes into a drastically different clothing set, then it may not work. You may have to have new layers added, and you may have to change your rig. So you kind of just have to update your rig depending on what you're doing there. So now that I've done the analysis of what I want to do, and I can just call this my analysis layer if I want to. Sometimes it helps to sketch it out ahead of time, but you don't have to do that, but it helps you to think about it when you want to sketch it out ahead of time. Now at this point I can go in here and I can start to make the different layers that I'm working with. Sometimes it's easier just to turn off all the other layers except the one that you're working on, which you can do very easily using the Hide All Other Layers button, which is the checkbox with the eyeballs on it. So if I'm just going to work on the legs right now, I can just turn off the legs. You can see here, even though I worked with separated layers in Photoshop, I still need more layers than I did in my Photoshop file. So for example, here, I need one layer for each pant leg, and then I need one layer for that crotch area. So I do still need to break apart this drawing from what I had in Photoshop. The people who are doing your design and who are doing, it may be you may be doing the whole project, but if you have another team that does the design of the characters, they may not know enough about character rigging to know how many layers you need, which layers you need separated. So you may still have to go back and make adjustments on the drawings after they've already been designed. Even if they were designed in vector to begin with, you may have to make some changes. So I'm just going to go ahead here and add some drawing layers as I go. Add drawing layer button there. And then as a process, what I'm going to do is I'm going to think about two things here. I'm going to first think about drawing, and I'm going to draw with my pencil tool for the lines, because the pencil tool gives you the ability to have a thick and thin line with texture, if you want texture, that you can move around afterwards and that you can change the thickness afterwards. It's the best line for doing cleanup work. There's no reason really to use the brush line anymore. In addition to doing the drawings, I'm also going to be thinking about overlap. This is most important thing here. When it comes to overlap, let's make that a different color so it's easier to see my notes here. I don't know what color is easy. Blue. Okay, so when it comes to overlap, you really want to make sure that you do have overlapping regions so that if you have to move, rotate, or scale an object, that you don't see the other layers underneath it. So if I'm keeping these things in mind, the next thing I'm going to do here as my character rig is I'm going to create a new color palette, and I am going to usually you give your color palette the name of the character that you're working on. So I don't really have a name for this character, so I'm just going to call it character. And in here now, as I go, I'm going to start building up the color palettes that I'm going to use. So this character was drawn in the model sheet with colored lines. If I zoom in far enough, I can kind of see a little bit the pixels of the lines that I'm working on. If you're drawing, if you sort of already have a model sheet to work off of, you can create your colors here by color picking off the model sheet to get the right colors. So this is going to be the pants lines, and then you can always make adjustments on those colors later. And then I have the pants, and then I can add a new one and then color pick. When you're color picking off of a drawing, you always want to color pick with this little color picker in the corner of your color window there. And then I can click on this one and call this Pants Shadows. I'm not going to do the shadow right now. I'm going to show you how to do that in an advanced tip later on, but I'm going to create the color now so that I have it all. So now I have all my pants colors, and I can go ahead here and do some drawing. So when I do my drawings here, I'm going to think about doing some overlap, and I'm also going to use my pencil tool. So I can start by thinking about the layer that I want to use for what I'm calling my crotch layer, which is actually just sort of the hips area. And as I go, I can also name these. So let's call this hips. And then I can set up what I want my pencil tool to look like. So on the side here, I have kind of a crinkly charcoal style pencil line. So if I go in my tool properties, I can adjust the type of pencil that I'm working with so that I can use a texture or not. Maybe I do want to have a texture but make it a sort of a felt texture, so it's just a little bit of a texture. I will do that just for fun in this one, but if you want to have no texture at all, then you go to no opacity texture and you get your basic line that you're working with there. So for fun, let's go with something like felt or felt rough, something like that, just to give it a little bit of dimension here. And then I can adjust the size of my brush on the fly by holding down the O shortcut and then clicking and dragging, so I can get the size of my lines to be the right size. When you have a belt like this, in this case on this character I have a sweater that's covering it up, so it doesn't really matter. But if you are going to have like these lines that delineate where the belt loops are on your pants, then you want to do those in a separate layer. So let's just draw the general line here for the hips. And I'm doing my drawings today on a tablet, not a Cintiq, so it's a little bit easier when you are doing design stuff and rigging stuff. It is easier when you have to do a lot of drawing to do it using a Cintiq or a screen that you can draw on. Nowadays there are some tablet PCs also that you can use, but I don't have the liberty of having one here right now, so I'm just going to do this all on a tablet. I can overlap these areas. So this felt texture I think is making it hard for me to see what I'm doing. I can always turn the lines into a felt texture later, so I'm going to go ahead and for the moment go to no opacity texture and then hit apply on the pencil line to change the texture on those lines. And that'll just give me the lines that I can kind of see a little bit better what's going on here. When you're drawing on a tablet and you get a lot of points that are created that you don't want, you can just use your contour editor and select those points and then hit delete. So you can always go back in there and finesse your lines if the lines don't look perfect the first time around. And when you're working in either the pencil tool or the brush tool, then your lines are created with a thick and thin as well based off of the pressure sensitivity on your tablet. I often like to go in with my contour editor and turn on this snap to contour and just snap these points together to get a perfect shaped line. So when it comes to character rigging, I do like to get it kind of perfect because this is going to be your rig forever, so you might as well make sure that the lines do look really nice. And as you're animating later on, you might not have perfect lines all the time, but when you're making your initial character rig, I do think it's a good idea to try and get it as nice as possible. And when you're using the pencil tool, it makes it super easy to go back in here and make adjustments. So I don't have to redraw anything. I can just kind of come in here and fix anything that wasn't perfect the first time around, and I'm good to go. So in the most basic style of hips, the hips will always be behind your legs. If you are going to do a more advanced sort of crotch area, especially if you have a male character, you might also want to have a little piece that comes on top. You can either have that as a separate layer that you can animate separately, or it can be using some of these sub-art layers, which is kind of an advanced topic, so I'll get to that later. For now, we'll just do the basic style of rig, which is really just you have the layers that are kind of sitting on top of each other. So this is generally what my hips layer is going to look like. When you're doing the legs now, then you want to think about it like front leg and back leg. So if I turn on my my character, in my entire character here, so I can see what it looks like. The front of the character, because I'm doing a 3/4 view, I didn't mention earlier, by the way, I always start by rigging the 3/4 view, because a lot of the times now a 3/4 is enough, especially when you start doing some advanced effects. You don't need to have a separate front side view. You can do it all from the 3/4 and get a lot of motion. When you're doing a 3/4 view, you always have a front and a back, and the reason you call it front and back is because you may want to flip your character over. So the front layer is the one that's kind of like, in the front, so his shoulder here is in the front, that arm there is in the back. So this side is, and the reason you call it front is because if I flip the entire character over, the front is always in the front. If I call this left and then I flip the character over, the left is going to be on the right. So that makes it difficult. In this case, my character is not necessarily totally symmetrical. He has a bracelet on and he has a pattern on his shirt. There are ways of dealing with that. So for the moment, though, I'm going to treat him like a symmetrical character. Let's turn the hips layer back on so I have reference, and the pants layer so I have reference. Okay, so on the leg layer, I want to have first my leg front, underscore F for front, and then that's going to be this leg here. I'm not worried about filling in these layers right now because the layers are all very similar, and it's a little bit easier for me to draw it when I don't have the fill in. I'll go and fill it in just a moment. Sometimes just doing a simple drag on your line, a little drag can remove some of the contour points and simplify what that line looks like. Okay, so now that I've got all the lines done, I can go back and do the fill. So I might want to do the fill on the hips layer first. Let's go back and grab my color and fill it in. If you had no gaps, then it's going to fill it in just fine. If it doesn't fill it in, then it's probably because you do have gaps on your line somewhere. When I go on the leg layer, I do definitely have a gap because I drew the lines on the leg, but I didn't connect the lines together at the top. So there's a couple of tools that you can use to draw when you want to draw an invisible line. So you can draw either with your stroke tool or with your close gap tool. In the best practices, the best way of doing, particularly when you have something like a leg, is to draw sort of two versions of your leg. One that has the completed line and then one that doesn't, that you're going to sit on top. And so I'll explain to you the reason why. So let's go into the drawing view. We haven't looked at the drawing view yet. You can add your drawing view by clicking the down facing arrow, then selecting drawing. Drawing just lets you isolate out the individual drawing that you're working on. So here I can see what the lines are that I've done so far. And then you can also right click in this gray area here and select drawing view and click on the light to see the light table so you can see the other drawings sort of washed out. This is a good view to go in when you're rigging, when you're drawing the individual layers and you kind of need to see a reference, but you just want to see what you've done here. If I do this character and I have a version of it, whoops, let's go back to my pencil tool, sorry. And I do a version of it that has the completed line work underneath it. And I did that with the wrong color, so I can always just select the line and apply the line's color. Then having the completed line work underneath it is going to give me the flexibility of being able to rotate that leg. But I don't really want to see the line in the end. I just want to see it, without the line. So if I take this layer and I want to go through and subtract out what isn't the line. So what I'll do first is I'll just paint it in. So we'll see what I'm talking about. I'll paint it in with the pants color. There we go. So when I go back to my camera view and I look at this, it doesn't look nice because I see the line on top. But I kind of need the line there because let's put the legs underneath the hips for a second. If I rotate my leg layer, and just for the moment I'm going to take my advanced animation toolbar, so you can right click in the gray area at the top and select advanced animation, and I'll move my pivot point more or less where it's going to be so that I can test out this rig. So if I have the completed artwork underneath it, it gives me the flexibility of being able to rotate that leg, and that's really great. But I want to be able to hide the line where they intersect. So there's actually, a super easy way of doing this. You basically want to separate out the line and the color onto two different layers. So I can take the color that I did there and I can just kind of use Control X or Command X to cut, and I can go onto the color art layer under here and I can paste it. So within Toon Boom, if you think of it, each drawing has its own little sub-art layers. We call these art layers. They're also called, they have names. So the overlay is sort of on the top, then there's line art, color art, and then underlay is on the bottom of everything. And you can click on the preview button when you want to see everything together to get a sense of what it's going to look like. But basically you want to keep the line on the line art layer and the color on the color art layer. I only do this when I want to be able to use this sandwiching effect. I don't bother anymore to do it in all cases. I only do it when I want to sandwich, and particularly when you're using the pencil line. Because when you're using the pencil line, you want to take the width of your pencil and subtract it from the color so that when you overlap those elements, you get the proper width. And you kind of have to use a special effect to do this, because when you are doing it with your, if you have a pencil that has texture on it, then you need to use the effect so that you get the correct mask to put on top. For now, when I'm doing my breakdown stage, I'm just going to think about the fact that I need to do that later, and I'm going to leave it that way. So for most of the layers, I can keep the line art and the color art, or I can keep the entire drawing in the line art layer, but I will think about those layers that need to have overlap, and for those layers that have overlap, then I will do separated line on the line art and color on the color art. So just like I will with the back leg as well. So if I'm going to go now to my back leg, which I will draw the corresponding line in the back for. Okay, so if I'm going to do it now on this line art layer, there's actually a trick that you can use so that you don't have to cut and paste. So I can select all of my lines here with the select tool, and then in the properties of the select tool there's something called create color art from line art. If I just click on that button and then I go down to the color art layer, I see that it's created these sort of strokes here, these invisible strokes that I can use now to paint with. So I can just go to my paint color and I can paint them in. And now I'm all done. So in general, sort of as a thing to think about, when you have layers that you want to have overlapping and you're using the pencil line, then you want to go ahead and separate the line onto the line art and the color onto the color art. So I'm just going to go back and I will separate out the different layers, and I'll go through that on sort of speed play so that you can see that in fast version. I'll use all the same concepts that I've used up until this point when doing my drawing. I'm going to think about drawing with my pencil tool and about doing the overlap. When you do have regions where you've drawn two different pencil lines and you need them to be merged into one line, you can always select those two lines with your select tool, and then if you go in your tool properties, you have the ability there to merge pencil lines. And then if you do have a resulting sort of thickness change that you don't like, you have a separate tool in here called your pencil editor that defines the thickness key points. So you can always select the thickness key point just by dragging around it and then hit delete. If your character is symmetrical and you have a possibility of reusing some artwork, then you can do that while you're doing your design as well. So if I take a look in my drawing view here, if I turn my preview on, it lets me see both the line art and the color art. I did separate them for this arm as well because I want the arm to be sandwiched around the body. So if I go ahead here and select the artwork and I copy it, then I can create a new drawing layer for the back and paste the artwork, and it pastes everything. So now, still with my select tool active, I can bring the artwork over, I can flip it horizontally, and now I have the back arm without totally having to redraw everything. Of course, if I go to my camera view, I probably want to drag my arm underneath everything just so that I can see what the final output is going to look like here. With something like a bracelet that you might want to have be both in front of and behind the other layers. So for example, if I see what my hand and my arm look like underneath there, I want to be able to animate this bracelet around over time. So you can actually make use of some of Harmony's compositing tools to be able to put the color art of a layer behind and then line art of a layer in front. So that's also the same kind of sandwiching thing I was talking about earlier that I'll show you when we get to the rigging stage. So for the bracelet, I want to keep the stuff that's in front in the line art layer, and I can go in my color art layer and draw the part of the bracelet that's behind. And that way I'll be able to go in later and do some magic compositing tricks to make it go around the wrist. A couple of drawing tips that you may want to keep in mind when you're doing your drawings that I like to alternate frequently between, especially when I'm doing detailed stuff like the hair, I like to alternate between using the regular sort of drawing method where you're drawing everything on top, and then sometimes going in and using the draw behind to draw underneath. So I'll just do this with a different color to make it very obvious. So you see when I come in here and I use draw behind, it's laying the lines that I'm doing behind everything else. And that just makes it really easy if I was going to go in and fill this with blue, for example, to define the fill region. So that's one of the tips that I use quite a bit is the draw behind. Other tips that I'm using, I do sometimes draw lines separately and then merge them together. So I mentioned this earlier, but I can select the two lines, do the merge, and then I usually go back along the intersection and remove any contour points that are there, and also remove the pencil editor point there, and that gives you a really nice smooth line from beginning to end. There is also in your pencil tool a line building mode. When you turn this line building mode on, then you have the ability to kind of draw the line as you go, and it does work really well. It's just that I'm kind of used to working the old way, so I don't do that, but definitely give the line building tool a shot as well and see if that works out for you. So another tip here, when I am doing particularly detailed drawings, for example like with the hair, and I do want to have a little bit of texture in there, I can go in there and draw the texture with the brush tool. With one of these textured brushes if I feel like having a texture from the texture brush, or by simply enabling texture on a regular brush to get kind of a smooth looking line there. And you can also put an extra blur on any layer that you want later on. So if I decide I want to blur the overlay layer, I can do that and achieve some additional effects. So if you want to isolate out specific elements to blur them or whatever, then just make sure that you create them on a separate art layer, and you'll be able to do that later. Okay, so I've finished doing the character breakdown for these drawings based on the same technique that I showed you in the very beginning, and I kind of sped through that so that you didn't have to watch the whole thing, but that you could see it if you want to. So when we check out what I've got now for my final breakdown, I still need to add some effects to do masking, for example, on the eyes, which doesn't really make sense the way they look right now. But basically, I have my reference on the right-hand side here of what I started with so that you can see. And I've broken up drawings so that I can animate them separately. So I can animate the pieces of the hair around, so that I can animate the ear, the nose, the mouth. All of these are now separated drawing layers so that we can work with them. And the pieces of the clothing are all separate, and I can access all of them individually when I need to. I may have to do some changes in the ordering. If you want to check the ordering basically now, then you can always reorder the elements directly in your timeline here by sort of dragging the element and dropping it where it needs to be. So, you know, I might want to organize all these elements so the hoodie is in front, and then the jacket, and then the sleeve of the hoodie. So I want to drag and drop it underneath if it's going behind. So the sleeve of the hoodie needs to go behind the jacket. And I can get a basic kind of, or actually that sleeve of the hoodie is going to need to go all the way behind the sweater. So I can drag it all the way down here if I want to, behind the sweater. So if I want to get a basic ordering, I can do that just to double check and make sure that these elements are working. And I can kind of click the elements and just make sure that they're all separated here. I will save the pivot point in more detail stuff for next week when we'll go over the basic character rigging of how to rig these elements together. But for now, I've at least got the different elements separated out. And I've got them. I can check my model sheet here that I started with to make sure that my character's on model. If I need to make changes, I can make changes. I haven't addressed anything to do with shadows. That will come at the very end. And then we'll talk about next time how we can rig this character. So if we want to just check out in more detail here how I've laid this out, then I have separated out elements here for the hair. So hair usually will be broken up into several different pieces. The ear is on its own layer. I have the hair underneath. I have the eyebrows, the irises of the eyes, and then the white of the eyes with the line of the eye as well. So iris and eye, like so. And I'm going to mask those together next time. I have the mouth, the nose, the head as one big piece. You can also stick your drawing view on the side here if you want to see the individual drawing at the same time. So there I've got my drawing view here. I can do a Shift M and get my camera view back. So I can check out when I select a drawing here, then it will show the corresponding drawing there in the drawing view. I've separated out the hoodie elements, any sort of clothing elements that you think might need to be separated out. You can break this down even further, and once you get into advanced rigging, you might want to go into so much detail that you even mask out the V of the neck and move it around. I will show you that in an advanced one because it's quite useful. I have separated out the individual drawings for the different arms. So I have the hoodie sleeve, I have the sweater sleeve, and then I have the arm all as one piece. I'll attach all of these arms to the, or all of these pieces to the same rig next week, and we'll check that out and see if that's going to work. I've got the hand separated out. I have a bracelet here. I have the leg as one piece, which we're going to put one rig on. I have the hips, and then I have the shoes. So it's a pretty straightforward rig. It's not super complex. The main complexity came because I decided for some crazy reason that I wanted to do this crazy hoodie, jacket, sweater thing on the top, and then the other main complexity came from the hair, which is fairly detailed up here. So other than that, it's pretty much a straightforward character. I did want to give myself a couple of rigging challenges so that I can show you some tips and tricks when we get to the rigging section next week on how we can address those challenges, for example, with the clothing and with the necklace and the bracelet and those sorts of things. So take care. Hope that was useful so far in starting to analyze how to break down your character. If you're working with an Illustrator or Photoshop file, how you can import that in and use it as a reference and trace over it. If you are designing directly in Toon Boom, you can design with separated layers already. You can do a basic rough sketch of your character, and then you can do the clean drawing and design with Toon Boom colors directly with different layers, and that saves you a whole lot of time because you don't end up having to redraw anything. You're just drawing it once. So that's why I usually do highly recommend to do the design work directly in Harmony if you can. That way you save yourself the time and the effort, and you don't have to double up on your work. Okay guys, I'll see you next week.